Hello and welcome to the Daily Climate Show. Coming up today, lacking across the board. The government's advisors on climate change warned that the UK is unprepared for the impacts of the climate crisis. Hundreds of academics urged the Prime Minister to end approvals for new oil and gas projects in the UK. Could this be the future of food? Scientists grow meat using the cells of an extinct mammoth. Hello and welcome to the Daily Climate Show, where we track the changes to our world and investigate some of the potential solutions to the climate crisis. Now, the government's own independent climate advisors are warning that the UK is strikingly unprepared for the effects of climate change, with ministers presiding over a lost decade of preparations. In a new report, the Climate Change Committee has said last summer's 40-degree heatwave and drought show just how vulnerable the UK is to a hotter climate without better planning. Let's speak now to the Chief Executive of that committee, Chris Stark. Chris, thank you so much for joining us. So why is the UK so unprepared for the effects of climate change?
Well, that's a very important question, and I'm not sure I have a very good answer, because we are really seeing the impacts of climate change playing out now. I mean, we talk a lot about the period last summer. Of course, we had that first ever 40-degree centigrade day. That's just one of the signals of climate change. There's a host of others. Impacts now being felt across the board, right across the year, actually. And the UK is not alone in experiencing it. But let's not talk about the UK. Let's talk about people living in the country. I think people are now aware of climate change. They understand that we're in the grip of it. And yet, we do not have a programme of policies and plans from this government that is anywhere close to where it needs to be. When we look at that programme, it's called the National Adaptation Programme. I'm pretty sure that even the audience for this show is not one that has read that programme, because it's sitting away in a dusty cupboard somewhere. It's a small bit of government that has been tasked with bringing that together. And it just does not have the political focus that it really should have. So one of the reasons for publishing a report today, we're doing so early, we do one every couple of years, but we did it early this year to try and inform the next programme from this government, which is due in the summer.
Chris, let's talk about that report. Well, the report about the National Adaptation Programme, because it's quite stark. It says that this programme fails to match the scale of the challenge, lacks a clear vision, isn't underpinned by tangible outcomes or targets, and hasn't driven policy or implementation. How has that been allowed to happen?
Well, I'm afraid this is the effect of collectively politicians and politics not grasping the challenge. Now, I understand that. I understand that politics doesn't want to look into this and actually grab the size of it. But we really do need a political class that's ready to tackle this properly now. We can't duck this anymore. Sadly, for too long, we've been thinking about this as something for a future term of office. You know, climate change is something that will happen in the future, or even worse, climate change is something that will happen to other parts of the world and not to us. None of that is true, of course. Climate change is with us now. And even if it is happening somewhere else, we're also exposed to that too. Just think about the empty shelves that we've seen this year. That's the kind of impact that comes from extreme weather, climate-related impacts to supply chains in this country. That's just one of these impacts. So this is such an all-encompassing thing. It feels to me very strange that we haven't had politics tackle this in a more extreme way, in a more direct way. I think we've been looking a lot at the challenge of net zero, of course, and a very, very, very important goal of reaching net zero globally and reaching net zero in the UK. Now it seems to me is the time to raise the need to do the other bit of this, which is, of course, to achieve net zero, but also to adapt the economy, adapt our society to the change in the climate that we know is coming. Remember, if we hit net zero globally by the middle of this century, that will broadly keep us in some shape or form on track for the temperature targets in the Paris Agreement. But that means that we will have to see continuing warming for 2 decades, possibly 3 decades or more over that period. So this is something that's really now very, very important. And that there's a window for us to act on it. If we don't take it, of course, we're going to regret it later.
You have laid out a clear path for the government to improve the country's climate resilience. How optimistic are you that they are actually going to follow that path?
Well, I'm not sure that I am optimistic, but I am positive about the ability for us to do something about it. Again, one of the reasons for publishing a report early in the year this time is that we wanted to give the government a bit of time to prepare for that. We've had 2 national adaptation programmes covering the last decade and more. We refer to that as a lost decade because they haven't really grabbed the issue in the way that they should. If anything, what they're doing is kind of hoovering up a set of things that the government was already doing and putting them in one place. That's not a real programme. That's a description of things that were already happening. It's not a surprise to me that the things that we have acted on in this country have been the things that the politicians feel the most pressure on. And that's why flooding is an issue that has been grasped. Of course, there's more to do in flooding, but it's one, of course, that gets more attention. We need to give the same attention to other areas. So this next programme is coming up from the government. It's due in the summer at some point. It's led by DEFRA. And I think really important, we've set out what we think we need to see in that. There's some really useful advice there for the government if they want to take it. If the government doesn't take it, then I think we're into a different world of actually dialing up the criticism still further and asking questions about whether DEFRA itself is able to cope with these kind of important national issues.
Okay. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you.
Right, let's take a look at some of the day's other stories now. And the European Court of Human Rights is to consider 2 cases of European governments accused of failing to protect the environment. In Switzerland, more than 2,000 people are claiming the government's climate change policies are risking their health and their living conditions. And in France, a former mayor is accusing the government of taking insufficient steps to prevent climate change. A new study has found that microplastic pollution along the country's coastline is 100 times the level it was 6 years ago. The data was collected last summer by teams competing in the GB Rowing Challenge around the UK. Scientists at the University of Portsmouth then analysed the samples using new technology that allowed them to get a more accurate picture of pollution levels. Now, to demonstrate the potential of lab-grown meat, an Australian company has created this. It's a meatball using the genetic code of a woolly mammoth. The project aims to show the potential of creating meat products without the slaughter of animals. The company, called Vow, hopes the technology could help vastly reduce the huge environmental impact of meat production. Would you eat that, is the question. Hundreds of academics have sent a letter to the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak urging him to end approvals for all new oil and gas developments. It comes on the eve of a planned government announcement on energy security and net zero. The letter has been signed by 700 experts from universities and research bodies across the UK. It says approving new oil fields like the proposed Rosebank project off Shetland would undermine the UK's position as a global climate leader. Well, let's speak to someone who's actually signed that letter, Professor Emily Shuckburgh, who's the director of Cambridge Zero at the University of Cambridge. Emily, thank you so much for talking to us. So why have you signed this letter and what are you hoping it achieves?
Well, the IPCC came out last Monday to say that there is a rapidly closing window to secure a livable future for all. And we just heard from Chris Starks how we're seeing those impacts of climate change playing out in the UK and across the world today. In that context, we really wanted, as the climate research community, to send a very strong statement to the government that it is simply incompatible with our national and international response to climate change to be looking at this time to open up new fossil fuel infrastructure. The IPCC was very clear, in fact, that emissions from existing fossil fuel infrastructure without additional abatements such as carbon capture and storage would be sufficient to exhaust the budget to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees of warming.
What do you make of the argument that if we do stop the new development of oil and gas, there will be real concerns about both the affordability and the security of our energy supplies, which is something that we have seen this year already, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. Both the affordability and the security of supplies are an incredibly important element to consider. But the absolute most powerful way of securing affordability and security of supply is to really look at enhancing our renewable technologies that we already have in place, whether that's solar or wind, and enhancing the necessary storage technologies technologies that are associated with that. We know how to produce our energy needs without fossil fuels. And another really critical element of that, of course, is looking at energy efficiency, how we can improve the insulation of our homes, which we know is something that is really poor in the UK, and therefore reduce our dependency on our fossil fuel infrastructure.
So what do you make of the proposed Rosebank oil field off the Shetland Islands?
Well, I think just the fact that we had so many people from the UK academic community sign this letter to the Prime Minister sends a really strong statement that, as I say, it is just scientifically incompatible with our climate response and our duty to take leadership, national and international leadership associated with this, to be looking to expand fossil fuel infrastructure at this time.
Okay, Emily, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Now, Poole Harbour was the subject of a damaging oil leak earlier this week, raising fears about the impact on wildlife in an area of special scientific interest. Our Data and Forensics Unit has been looking into what happened. Adam Parker reports.
Something of an environmental disaster happening out here, and nobody seems to know it's happening.
A major incident was declared on Sunday after around 20,000 litres of reservoir fluid leaked from a pipeline in Dorset. The fluid, made up of 85% water and 15% oil, came from Our Bay into Poole Harbour. It's tidal, so the leaked oil will have been moving into surrounding waters. The Witch Farm onshore oil field is the largest in Western Europe. It's operated by Perenco. The main gathering station is here, with crude oil extracted from more than 10 well sites. The pipelines connecting them run around 2 to 3 metres underground. Sky News understands the leak occurred here, next to well site D. Bubbling water was spotted, indicating oil was rising from below ground. The view from the gathering station across the harbour shows the area immediately affected by the spill. On the far side, 2 miles from the leak, this video is filmed from Hamworthy Park. And this was taken at Poole Quay, also on the other side of the harbour. At the leak location, as part of the clean-up operation, a floating skimmer is being used to extract the oil from the surface. It's being pumped into this portable tank and extracted by the tanker. Downstream, closer to Poole Harbour, booms are being used to stop the spread further and contain the spill. People are being told to stay out of the water, and while the full environmental impact is not yet known, the RSPB says oil birds have been spotted around the harbour. This shell duck was showing signs of contamination at Litchett Bay, more than 4 miles from the leak. We don't know yet exactly how the leak happened, but the government says a full investigation will take place. Adam Parker, Sky News.
Before we go, a reminder that we want your climate questions. Anything that's ever mystified you about the environment or whatever you want to get to the bottom of, scan this QR code and send us your questions, which we will answer in the Climate Show with Tom Heap. And you can watch Tom's show on Saturday and Sunday at 3 p.m. here on Sky News. That's all from us today. Thank you so much for watching.